The atmosphere in the grand ballroom was electric, buzzing with the chatter of high-profile guests, celebrities, and martial arts enthusiasts. A charity event meant to raise funds for underprivileged kids had gathered some of the most iconic names in the action world. But there was one standoff happening that no one had anticipated. A showdown between two living legends of martial arts and action films, Michael Jai White and Steven Seagal. The crowd was buzzing with excitement, but there was an undercurrent of tension. No one dared speak of it out loud, but the rivalry between these two men had been simmering for years. It wasn't just a friendly competition or a matter of professional respect. It was personal. Michael Jai White, renowned for his incredible martial arts prowess and work in films like Undisputed the Second and Blood and Bone, had always maintained a low-key, humble approach to his success. He let his actions speak louder than words. On the other hand, Steven Seagal, an established action star known for his unique style of Aikido and iconic movies, like Under Siege and Above the Law, had a reputation for arrogance. He often claimed that his martial arts abilities were unmatched and that no one could rival him in skill or technique. Seagal's public persona was that of a man who believed his status in both Hollywood and martial arts was indisputable. Tonight, however, the atmosphere was different. Michael Jai White had never been one to seek out a fight, but he wasn't one to back down from a challenge either. And Seagal, he was famous for his belief that his skills were superior to anyone else's. So when the two men locked eyes across the crowded ballroom, it wasn't a question of if something would happen, but when. Would the tension bubble over into a confrontation? Would egos clash in front of the cameras and the watching crowd? No one could say for sure. The quiet, confident presence of Michael Jai White contrasted sharply with Seagal's swaggering demeanor, his confidence bordering on arrogance. And in that moment, with the weight of history hanging in the air, no one knew exactly what would happen next. But they all knew one thing: this would be a moment no one would forget. The night was still young, but the energy inside the grand ballroom of the charity event was already palpable. Celebrities in sharp suits and glamorous gowns laughed and chatted, mingling with business tycoons and martial arts fans, who had come from all over the world to meet their heroes. The lights above were dimmed just enough to create an intimate ambiance, while a soft, jazzy band played in the corner. It was a night designed to celebrate strength, generosity, and the power of martial arts. Yet no one could have predicted the electric tension that had been building between two of the most iconic names in action films. Michael Jai White stood near the back of the room, dressed in a simple black suit. His eyes were calm, his presence barely noticeable amidst the glitz and glamour surrounding him. White was a man of few words, someone who let his impressive martial arts skills and film roles do the talking for him. His calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the larger-than life presence of Steven Seagal, who was making his entrance at that very moment. Seagal entered the ballroom with a sense of self-assuredness that only someone of his stature could carry. Wearing his signature black outfit, his long hair tied back in a ponytail, and his face showing a confident grin, he exuded the aura of someone who believed his mere presence was enough to command respect. People parted in his path as if he were a king walking among commoners. His reputation as a martial arts expert with his own unique style of Aikido preceded him everywhere he went, and tonight, it was no different. Seagal walked toward the bar with a slow, deliberate pace. His movements were fluid, like a man who had nothing to prove, but as he passed, he couldn't help but notice the subtle glances people threw at him. Some were of admiration, others of quiet judgment, but Seagal thrived on the attention. He had earned his spot at the top, or so he believed. There was no one who could rival his abilities. Not in the ring, not in the dojo, and certainly not in Hollywood. Michael Jai White watched him from across the room, his gaze steady but not combative. White had earned his own place in the action world, with decades of experience in martial arts and a solid film career. But unlike Seagal, he carried none of the air of superiority. There was no need for it. His reputation spoke for itself, and it was built on the foundation of hard work, skill, and humility. However, Michael knew the history between him and Seagal. They had crossed paths before, and each time there had been an undercurrent of tension. The two had never truly clashed, but rumors of Seagal's dismissive attitude toward others in the martial arts community had long reached Michael's ears. He had heard the stories, How Seagal would often boast about his Aikido expertise while belittling other martial artists. Michael didn't take kindly to that kind of behavior. Respect, to him, was earned through dedication and discipline, not through self-promotion or arrogance. As Seagal made his way to a small circle of people, including a few Hollywood producers and former martial arts champions, Michael decided it was time to approach. There was no need to avoid the elephant in the room. He had trained with some of the best in the world and earned the respect of countless martial artists and filmmakers. But tonight wasn't about fighting for dominance. It was about testing the waters, feeling the energy, and seeing if they could bridge the gap that had long existed between them. Michael walked toward the bar, his movements calculated and measured. The crowd seemed to part naturally as he made his way, aware of the presence he carried without the need for fanfare. His expression was neutral, calm, not giving away any sign of the tension building inside him. When Seagal saw Michael approaching, his eyes narrowed, just slightly. He didn't smile or greet him with the warmness of someone meeting a friend. Instead, he looked at him with a sense of superiority, as if to say, "What are you doing here?" "Michael Jai White," Seagal said, his voice smooth, but with a hint of challenge. "Never thought I'd see you at one of these." Michael offered a nod but said nothing at first. He was used to Seagal's reputation, but he wasn't about to let it define the conversation. "I didn't come here for the spotlight," Michael said, his voice steady. "I came here to support a cause. But I'm curious. How's life been treating you?" Seagal raised an eyebrow. He wasn't used to people questioning his position in the world of martial arts and film. Most people either worshipped him or stayed out of his way. Michael's casual approach to the situation unnerved him slightly. "I'm doing just fine," Seagal replied, but there was an edge in his voice. "You know, I've spent decades mastering Aikido. There's a certain level of expertise that not many can match. It's more than just technique, it's an art." Michael nodded thoughtfully, his gaze never wavering. "I respect your dedication. But martial arts isn't just about the art. It's about respect. You can have all the expertise in the world, but if you don't respect others, it doesn't mean much." Seagal's expression faltered for a moment, but only briefly. He took a sip from his drink, not fully acknowledging Michael's point. Instead, he leaned closer, his voice low. "I don't think you really understand what I'm saying. People like me, we don't need to prove ourselves. We've already done that." Michael's eyes narrowed slightly. "That was the challenge, wasn't it?" "Well," Michael said quietly, "I believe actions speak louder than words." The room seemed to grow quieter as the subtle tension escalated between the two. The fight hadn't started yet, but it was clear that the words exchanged between Michael and Seagal had set something in motion, and everyone watching could feel it. The hum of the party seemed to fade as the energy in the room shifted. Conversations slowed, and the once jubilant mood became charged with anticipation. Michael Jai White and Steven Seagal were no longer just two men at a charity event. They were two giants of the martial arts world, each carrying a legacy that demanded respect. And yet, the quiet war of egos had begun. For a few moments, neither man spoke. The tension in the air was palpable, like a fuse just waiting to ignite. Michael stood with his arms crossed, still calm and collected, but there was an unmistakable resolve in his posture. Seagal, on the other hand, was visibly irritated, his lips curling into a slight sneer as he took another long sip of his drink. The words exchanged were more than just casual banter. They were loaded with challenge, testing the other's strength, patience, and pride. Seagal, a man who had spent years perfecting his own martial arts style, a blend of Aikido and his own interpretations, wasn't used to being questioned, least of all by someone who, in his eyes, was still a relative newcomer in comparison. His reputation in the action world had made him a star, and his belief in his own superiority over others had become part of his identity. He wasn't about to let someone like Michael Jai White undermine that image. "I didn't realize I was talking to an expert on Aikido," Seagal said, the tone of his voice shifting to one that was condescending. "But you see, Michael, the difference between you and me is that I don't need to talk about my skills to prove them. My reputation speaks for itself. The world knows who I am. I've trained and taught countless people." Michael didn't flinch. The remark was nothing new to him. He had heard Seagal boast about his achievements before. He had heard the rumors of Seagal's overblown sense of self-importance, how he liked to remind others of his unparalleled success. Michael knew that in a way Seagal was trying to provoke him, to draw him into a battle of words. But Michael was having none of it. "I'm not here to prove anything to you, Stephen," Michael said, his voice measured but firm. "I don't have to flaunt my skills. I don't need to put anyone else down to make myself feel better. That's not what martial arts is about." Seagal's face tightened. There was something in Michael's calmness that grated on him. It was as if Michael had completely dismissed the challenge Seagal was so eager to present. In Seagal's world, respect wasn't earned through humility or quiet confidence. It was earned through dominance. The idea that someone would stand before him and suggest otherwise was almost too much for his ego to bear. "Is that so?" Seagal asked, his voice lower now, with an unmistakable edge. "So you think that just because you're a nice guy in front of the cameras, you've earned your place? Let me tell you something. You can't be nice in this world and expect to get respect. People need to see your power. They need to feel it." Michael's gaze didn't waver. He wasn't reacting emotionally, and that was exactly what Seagal couldn't handle. Every fiber of Seagal's being wanted a reaction. He wanted Michael to lose his cool, to get drawn into a heated argument or a physical altercation. But Michael wasn't biting. He wasn't playing by Seagal's rules. "I'm not interested in playing power games, Stephen," Michael replied coolly. "Real power comes from within. It's about control. It's about knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. You don't have to shout to make people listen." Seagal scoffed, clearly irritated by the lack of response. He wasn't used to someone standing their ground so firmly, without flinching, without hesitation. It was beginning to eat at him, and his irritation slowly began to turn into a full-blown challenge. "Fine," Seagal said, setting his drink down on the counter with a slight thud. "If you think you're the better man, then prove it. Right here, right now." The words hung in the air like a challenge, an unspoken dare. The crowd that had been watching the exchange, now sensing that things were about to escalate, grew silent. There was no turning back. Everyone in the room had been waiting for something like this. The inevitable clash of egos between two martial arts legends. Michael's stance remained unchanged. He was still calm, unbothered. But there was no denying that the challenge had been thrown. This wasn't about proving who was stronger in the traditional sense. It wasn't about a brawl for the crowd's entertainment. This was about a clash of philosophies, a battle of respect, and a test of control. Michael wasn't going to back down, but he wasn't going to be the one to escalate it either. "If it's a fight you want, it's a fight you'll get," Michael said, his words clipped. "But this isn't going to be what you expect." Seagal grinned. "I don't need to expect anything. I'll just let my actions speak for me." In that moment, there was no more pretense. No more polite conversation. The crowd that had been surrounding the two men parted, creating an impromptu ring of spectators. The stage was set for something that, no matter the outcome, would leave everyone in the room with a story to tell for years. Michael took a deep breath, centering himself. His hands were at his sides, relaxed, but ready. Seagal, too, assumed a stance, ready to demonstrate his self-proclaimed superiority. The tension in the room was unbearable now, and the fight was inevitable. And then, with a sudden, silent swiftness, it began. Michael moved first, his body fluid and precise. He closed the distance between them in an instant, his first strike calculated to test Seagal's reaction. Seagal responded with a classic Aikido move, an attempt to twist Michael's arm. But Michael was already one step ahead. He sidestepped effortlessly, his movements too fast for Seagal to anticipate. Seagal's eyes widened in surprise. This wasn't what he had expected. Every movement he made, every strike, was countered with a calm, controlled precision. The crowd around them gasped as they realized that what they were witnessing wasn't just a clash of egos. It was a battle of true skill, and Michael Jai White was in control. Seagal grunted, frustration mounting. He attempted to grab Michael in a chokehold, but Michael twisted his body in a way that Seagal hadn't anticipated, quickly breaking free. This wasn't just about speed. It was about something deeper, something Seagal didn't understand. Humility and control. The atmosphere in the ballroom had shifted. What started as a friendly charity event had quickly turned into a spectacle. The onlookers, who had initially been whispering and watching with curiosity, were now fully invested in the tension between Michael Jai White and Steven Seagal. The buzz in the air was electric, a mix of anticipation and disbelief as the two martial arts legends squared off in a silent battle for dominance. Seagal had always prided himself on his Aikido techniques, a martial art known for its fluidity and emphasis on using an opponent's force against them. However, as the fight between the two men unfolded, it became increasingly apparent that Seagal's moves were predictable, slow, and filled with a sense of overconfidence. He didn't expect anyone to challenge his expertise, especially not someone like Michael Jai White. Michael, on the other hand, was calm, fluid, and adaptable. Every movement he made seemed calculated, precise, and effortless. His strikes were sharp and deliberate, and his footwork was immaculate. There was no wasted energy, no overzealous attacks. Just a quiet, controlled exhibition of true martial arts mastery. He wasn't showing off, but rather demonstrating a clear superiority in skill and understanding of the martial arts principles. Seagal's first attempt to grapple Michael into a wrist lock was thwarted as Michael fluidly spun out of his grasp, his movements seamless and natural. It wasn't a show of force, but a demonstration of finesse, a stark contrast to Seagal's brute strength and reliance on his own rigid techniques. Seagal's face betrayed the frustration he was beginning to feel. His confidence, which had been so overpowering just moments earlier, now seemed like nothing more than a mask. "I'm not here to embarrass you, Steven," Michael said calmly, his voice barely audible over the hum of the crowd. "But if you keep pushing, you're going to see just how big the gap really is." Seagal sneered but didn't respond with words. Instead, he launched himself at Michael using his signature move, a spinning throw meant to take down his opponent with a sudden burst of power. But Michael was ready. He had already anticipated the move, and with an almost imperceptible shift in weight, he sidestepped, allowing Seagal to fly past him and crash into a nearby table. The crowd gasped, some of them even flinching at the sight. But Michael didn't take advantage of Seagal's misstep. He stepped back silently, allowing Seagal to recover. He didn't need to prove anything with a cheap shot or an easy victory. His confidence lay not in the spectacle, but in the quiet mastery of his craft. Seagal, now enraged, slowly pushed himself off the floor, dusting himself off. His ego had been bruised, but his pride was even more wounded. He couldn't fathom the idea that someone, anyone, could be better than him, especially not someone like Michael Jai White, whom he had always dismissed as just another action star trying to prove himself. "You're a lot more arrogant than I thought," Seagal muttered, a tightness in his voice. "You think you've got it all figured out?" Michael remained unfazed, his posture relaxed but ready. "It's not arrogance to know your limits. Steven, arrogance is thinking there's nothing left to learn." This comment seemed to sting Seagal more than anything else. His face twisted in anger, his pride refusing to allow him to be lectured by someone he considered beneath him. He lunged again, this time with an even more aggressive move, aiming for a powerful strike at Michael's chest. But Michael had already seen it coming. In a swift, fluid motion, he caught Seagal's arm mid-flight and twisted it, turning Seagal's momentum against him. The force of the movement sent Seagal crashing onto the floor once more, his body sprawling across the polished wood. The silence in the room was deafening. Seagal lay on the floor, breathing heavily, unable to hide the astonishment in his eyes. He had never been bested like this. Not in front of a crowd, not by someone he had written off as a lesser fighter. His chest heaved as he tried to regain his composure. There was no denying it now. Michael Jai White wasn't just a martial artist. He was a master, and he had proven it with every move, every counter, every calculated decision. Michael stood above him, not with triumph, but with the quiet dignity of someone who knew they had done exactly what needed to be done. There was no need for celebration, no need for a taunt or victory speech. He simply waited for Seagal to get up, knowing that the lesson had been learned, even if Seagal wouldn't admit it aloud. Seagal pushed himself up from the ground, his body trembling slightly. His pride was shattered, but he wasn't about to let Michael see the extent of his frustration. He straightened his posture, wiped the dirt from his clothes, and tried to regain some semblance of control. But the damage was done. The crowd, who had been watching in silence, slowly began to murmur among themselves, their eyes wide with shock. They had all expected Seagal to be the one who dominated the encounter. He was, after all, the one with the decades of martial arts experience, the bigger reputation, the louder presence. But instead, it was Michael Jai White who had shown, without a doubt, that skill, humility, and precision were far more powerful than arrogance and brute strength. Seagal looked at Michael, his gaze no longer filled with anger, but something more reflective. And maybe, just maybe, a hint of respect. "You've got something I don't have," Seagal said, his voice barely a whisper, "and I've been too blind to see it." Michael nodded once, not in arrogance, but in understanding. "It's not about what I have, Stephen. It's about what you're willing to learn." For the first time in a long time, Seagal didn't respond with a sharp retort. He simply nodded and walked away, his ego bruised but his mind undoubtedly reflecting on the lesson that had just been taught. The crowd, still in awe, whispered to each other, many pulling out their phones to capture the moment, but no one was focusing on the spectacle. They were focused on the lesson that had unfolded before them, a lesson not in power, but in humility. In the end, it wasn't the fight that made the biggest impact. It was the way Michael Jai White had handled himself, with calm, control, and a quiet strength that left everyone in the room questioning the true meaning of respect. The silence in the room stretched longer than anyone expected. Even the hum of the quiet jazz music from the corner seemed to fade into the background. People shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to do now that the confrontation had passed. The once eager whispers had been replaced with the sound of hushed conversations, some discussing what they had just witnessed, others still processing the sheer magnitude of the event. Seagal was still standing, but he wasn't the towering figure of confidence that had entered the room only hours earlier. His shoulders were slumped, and his face, usually a mask of impenetrable cool, was now creased with frustration and something else, humility. Michael Jai White, in contrast, had barely broken a sweat. His posture remained straight, his expression calm. He hadn't needed to say a word after the encounter. His actions had spoken volumes, and that had made all the difference, as Seagal stood there, trying to compose himself. He was oblivious to the group of men who had entered the ballroom. They moved swiftly, dressed in sharp suits, their steps purposeful, as though they had business to attend to. The crowd parted instinctively, giving them room to pass through. Their presence wasn't subtle. There was an authority in their demeanor, the kind that made everyone in the room instinctively aware that these weren't just any businessmen. One of the men, a tall, broad, shouldered executive with a clean-cut appearance, stepped forward. He locked eyes with Michael and smiled. "Mr. White, there you are," he said with a tone of familiarity that surprised those standing nearby. "We've been looking for you." Seagal turned his head at the sound of the voice, his eyebrows furrowing in confusion. "What's going on?" he muttered, a mix of irritation and curiosity in his voice. Michael's expression remained unchanged, but there was a slight shift in his demeanor as he acknowledged the group of men. One of them was holding a binder full of documents. Another was carrying a briefcase. They all seemed to be waiting for something, or someone. And that someone, as it turned out, was Michael. The tall executive extended his hand toward Michael with a knowing smile. "It's good to see you again, sir. We've got everything set up, and the paperwork's ready for you." Michael glanced briefly at Seagal, who was now standing a few paces away, his confusion growing as the group approached Michael with such familiarity. "What's this about?" Seagal asked, his voice sharp. Michael offered a polite nod to the executive before responding. "I came here tonight for the charity, Stephen, but it looks like there's another reason I'm here too." Seagal's face twisted as the realization dawned on him. The pieces began to fit together in his mind, though he wasn't entirely sure what was happening. Michael was no ordinary guest at this event. Something more significant was unfolding right before him, and it wasn't about a fight. It was about power, ownership, and control. The executive turned to Seagal, his tone professional but firm. "Stephen, I believe you've met Mr. Michael Jai White, yes? Well, you may not know this, but he's the new majority owner of this bank. We've been in talks for the past few months, finalizing everything." Seagal froze. His expression morphed from confusion to disbelief. "What?" he asked, unable to grasp the full weight of what was happening. "This man, he owns this place." Michael nodded calmly, his voice still collected. "I do now." The room seemed to go silent once more. Those who had been watching the confrontation between the two martial artists, the battle of egos and pride, were now watching something even more dramatic unfold. The revelation hit hard. The man Seagal had just tried to dominate. The man he had underestimated and ridiculed was, in fact, the person in control of the very bank where they were standing. He was the owner. The power dynamic had shifted completely. Seagal's jaw tightened as he took in the news. His eyes flicked between the men surrounding Michael and the documents in their hands. The executives were practically glowing with respect for Michael, but Seagal was still processing the shock of it all. Wait, you've been involved with this bank all along, and you didn't say a word. Michael's expression softened, but it was clear that the situation had changed in more ways than one. There was no need to announce it before tonight, Stephen. I wanted to handle things quietly as it should be, but now that you've gotten a taste of what's to come, I thought you might want to know. This isn't about me trying to outdo you, Stephen. It's about showing people how real strength is wielded. Humility, respect, and grace. Those are the qualities that deserve recognition, not arrogance. Seagal stood in stunned silence, his mind racing. This wasn't what he had expected. He had entered this event with one idea in mind: to showcase his power, his dominance, and his superiority. Instead, he had just been humbled by a man he had written off as just another action star. But what stung more than anything was the fact that Michael's victory wasn't just a personal one. It wasn't even about their fight or his martial arts prowess. It was about ownership, control, and how one individual could change the entire atmosphere of a room with nothing but calm authority. As Seagal stood there, still processing the truth, the executives continued their discussion with Michael. They presented him with documents to sign, ensuring everything was in order for the final steps of the acquisition. Michael didn't rush through the process. He took his time, as always, listening and making sure everything was handled with the same care and precision that defined his life. Seagal, still reeling from the shock, finally spoke again, but his words lacked the usual bite. I had no idea, I guess. I guess I was wrong. Michael's gaze turned toward him, a subtle smile on his face. It's never too late to change, Stephen. But maybe next time, think before you act. The irony was thick. The man who had built his entire career on projecting power had just been shown that true strength didn't come from making others feel small. It came from within, and Michael Jai White, in his quiet, controlled way, had just proven that lesson. As the executives began to finalize the paperwork, Michael turned back toward Seagal, his voice soft yet firm. I didn't come here to make an enemy, Stephen. I came here to set an example. Seagal looked up at him, the fire in his eyes having dimmed. For the first time that night, he wasn't just seeing Michael as a competitor. He was seeing him as a person to be respected. The realization settled in, and in that moment, Seagal understood the true weight of humility. With a slow nod, Seagal spoke, his voice quieter than before. I get it now. I won't forget this. Michael gave a nod in return. The words unspoken but understood. Respect is earned. And tonight, that was the lesson learned by everyone in the room. As the night wore on, the executives completed their business, and Michael quietly exited the ballroom. His role in the charity event had been completed, but the greater lesson was just beginning to sink in. The atmosphere in the ballroom had shifted entirely. What had begun as a glitzy charity event, filled with the usual mix of glamour and celebrity, had now become a moment in time that would be etched into the minds of everyone who witnessed it. The confrontation between Michael Jai White and Steven Seagal had turned into something far deeper than just a clash of egos. It had become a lesson in humility, power, and respect. Michael, with his quiet confidence and unwavering control, had walked away from the fight with more than just a personal victory. He had won something far more important: the silent respect of everyone in the room. Even Seagal, who had come in with an attitude of arrogance and superiority, had begun to feel the weight of his own hubris. And it was a feeling he couldn't shake. As Michael finished his conversation with the executives, completing the necessary paperwork for his recent acquisition, he could feel the eyes of the room upon him. No one dared approach him directly, but the whispers were there. People were still processing what had just happened. The fight, the revelation of Michael's ownership, and the way in which he had carried himself throughout it all. But there was one person in particular who had been quietly observing the events unfold from the sidelines. someone who had stayed out of the drama, remaining respectful and composed even when the chaos seemed to surround her. An older woman, a bank clerk who had worked at Grand State Bank for years, had watched the entire thing unfold. She had seen Seagal's arrogance, Michael's quiet strength, and the eventual moment when Seagal was finally confronted with the truth. But more than anything, she had seen how Michael had never taken advantage of the situation. He had shown restraint when he could have easily humiliated Seagal, and in doing so he had earned something that went beyond mere respect. He had earned admiration, as the executives began to pack up, preparing to leave. The clerk slowly made her way toward Michael. She had been with the bank for decades and had seen her share of high-profile guests, but something about this night had left a lasting impression on her. "Mr. White," she said, her voice respectful but filled with curiosity. "I just wanted to say that I've never seen anything like what you did tonight." Michael turned to face her, his expression softening. He smiled politely but said nothing at first, allowing her the space to continue. "Most people in your position would have rubbed it in, you know, embarrassed Mr. Seagal in front of everyone," she continued. "But you didn't. You stayed calm, and you treated him with dignity. Even after all of that, that's something rare. You showed what true strength is." Michael nodded, grateful for her words but not one to seek praise. It wasn't about Seagal or anyone else. It was about showing that respect is more important than pride. Humility isn't weakness, and true strength doesn't come from putting others down. The clerk smiled softly, nodding as she processed his words. "I've worked at this bank for over 20 years, and I've seen a lot of things. But I can't say I've ever seen someone handle themselves the way you did. You've earned the respect of everyone in this room tonight, Mr. White." Michael looked down for a moment, thoughtful. He had never been one to flaunt his achievements or bask in the spotlight, but in this moment he understood that it wasn't about the applause or the recognition. It was about integrity and how you carried yourself when no one was watching. "You know," Michael said after a pause, "there's a difference between being loud and being heard. Sometimes the loudest voices are the ones that speak the least." The clerk's eyes brightened with understanding. "You're right," she said, "and that's why you're the one people will remember. Not because of your skills, but because of how you carry yourself. You've set an example for all of us." Michael smiled, nodding in acknowledgement. "I'm just trying to live by the values that were instilled in me. You can be as good as you want, but if you don't treat others with respect, it doesn't mean much." The clerk paused for a moment before continuing, a hint of sadness in her eyes. "You know, Mr. White, it's a shame that not everyone sees that." Mr. Clark, the bank manager, he thought power was about belittling others. He thought he could climb the ladder by putting people down, but look where it got him. Michael's expression darkened slightly at the mention of Clark. He hadn't forgotten the man who had treated him with such disdain when he walked into the bank earlier that day. The way Clark had arrogantly dismissed him, thinking he was some broke, unknown client. But in that same moment, Michael knew that Clark had been more than just an obstacle to his deposit. He had been a representation of the arrogance that permeated so many places of power. People like him, who believed they could stand on others to lift themselves higher, had no understanding of true power. "Clark will learn," Michael said quietly. "Not from me, but from the people around him. Power doesn't come from making others feel small. It comes from lifting them up. Maybe one day he'll figure that out." The clerk nodded, but there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. "Maybe he will. But in the meantime, I'm glad you're here. You're the kind of leader we need." Michael smiled again, this time with more warmth. "It's not about me. It's about all of us working together and respecting one another." Just as the conversation was wrapping up, the bank manager, Mr. Clark, walked into the lobby. His eyes darted nervously around, clearly trying to avoid Michael's gaze. He had heard the murmurs, the whispers about what had transpired earlier, and he knew that the revelation about Michael's ownership had sent shockwaves through the room. As his eyes landed on Michael, a flicker of panic crossed his face. He knew he had made a grave mistake by underestimating the man in front of him, by belittling him and dismissing him as just another rich client. And now, with everything that had happened, he wasn't sure what would happen next. Michael met Clark's gaze, his expression unreadable. The tension between them was thick. But Michael didn't rush into the confrontation. He simply stepped aside, nodding toward the clerk who had been the only one to treat him with respect. Clark cleared his throat, his voice shaky. "Mr. White, I apologize for what happened earlier. I was out of line. I should have never." But Michael cut him off with a simple gesture of his hand. "Apology accepted, but actions speak louder than words. You'll have a chance to prove that you've learned something. I'm not the one who'll be judging you." Clark swallowed hard, unsure of what to say next. But before he could speak, Michael turned to the clerk and gave her a small nod. "I believe you're the new branch manager," Michael said quietly. The clerk's eyes widened in surprise. "What?" Michael smiled faintly. "You've shown respect, even when it wasn't easy. You've earned it." With that, Michael walked out of the bank, leaving behind a quiet storm of change and the undeniable lesson that had been taught to everyone who had witnessed it. Humility, integrity, and respect are the true markers of strength. And as Michael's footsteps faded into the distance, it was clear that tonight, the real victory wasn't in the fight, but in the quiet, powerful choices that had been made. As Michael Jai White stepped out of the bank, the quiet hum of the night air greeted him, a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded inside. He hadn't come for a fight, nor had he come for recognition, but in a way he had achieved both without lifting a finger. The battle had never been about physical strength. It had been about something much deeper: respect, humility, and true power. In the hours that followed, the story of what had transpired at Grand State Bank spread far beyond the walls of that building. The headlines were filled with the dramatic clash between the martial arts legends, Michael Jai White and Steven Seagal. But the real story wasn't the fight itself. It was what had happened afterward. It was the revelation that Michael, the man who had quietly stood his ground, was the new majority owner of the very institution that had initially turned him away. It was a lesson in humility that left people talking, and perhaps even rethinking their own perceptions of power. But the lesson was never about grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. Michael knew that the true lesson was far more subtle, and it was something that would resonate long after the event had passed. It wasn't the takedown that would be remembered, nor the ownership reveal that would make the headlines. It was the quiet strength Michael had demonstrated, his ability to remain calm under pressure, to not stoop to arrogance or boastfulness, but to simply let his actions speak for him. That was the real power he had shown. Michael's victory wasn't in the physical battle with Seagal. It wasn't in showing who was stronger, faster, or more skilled. It was in showing that strength could be measured not by how loud you were, but by how you handled yourself in moments of adversity. The fight itself had been a test of character, and Michael had passed with flying colors. The truth was, the world often associates power with noise. It's easy to think that those who dominate the conversation, those who are the loudest in the room, are the ones who hold the most sway. But real power, Michael knew, was different. True strength wasn't in overpowering others. It was in lifting them up and showing respect, even when others didn't deserve it. It was about maintaining integrity, even when the world around you was challenging you to abandon it. That was the kind of power Michael had shown. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud, and it certainly wasn't about proving anything. It was the kind of power that stayed quiet, stayed grounded, and didn't need to be acknowledged to be recognized. That power spoke volumes, and it was the kind of power that would last long after the applause had faded. Inside the bank, as the evening drew to a close, the shift had already begun. Mr. Clark, the manager who had once strutted through the lobby with arrogance and pride, now found himself reflecting on the events that had unfolded. The realization that he had dismissed a man with such quiet authority had shaken him to his core. He had misjudged Michael in a way that was hard to undo. The moment of burning that check, the sneering words, the arrogance, it had all come crashing down on him, leaving him wondering how he could ever regain the respect of those around him. In the back office, where Michael had taken his leave, the executive team continued to discuss the transition of ownership, but their conversations had shifted as well. It was clear that Michael wasn't just someone with financial clout. He was a leader. He had shown them what it meant to wield power responsibly, and what it looked like to use influence for the greater good. Michael didn't demand respect. He earned it. And he had done so in a way that would set the tone for the future of Grand State Bank. Meanwhile, the clerk who had witnessed the entire event found herself in a new position. Her respect for Michael had been earned the moment he entered the bank. But now, with the events of the evening unfolding before her, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. She had stayed respectful, calm, and true to herself, even when others were caught up in the drama. And now, she was being rewarded for it. She had been promoted to the new branch manager, a role she had never even considered before, but one that she had earned with her own quiet strength. It was a moment of recognition, not just for her, but for everyone who had witnessed Michael's example. The people who had stood by and watched his encounter with Seagal, those who had been caught in the spectacle, would leave the bank that night with a lesson that was far more valuable than any fight. They had seen firsthand what it meant to embody true strength, and how, in the end, it wasn't about proving yourself to others. It was about maintaining respect for yourself, no matter the circumstances. And as the night wore on, as Michael drove away from the bank and back into the quiet of his own life, he couldn't help but reflect on the journey he had been on. He hadn't sought to teach anyone a lesson. He hadn't tried to prove anything. But through his actions, he had shown what it meant to be a true leader. Not one who dominated or belittled others, but one who respected them. One who understood that real power came not from control, but from the strength to remain humble, even when you held the power to change everything around you. As the world continued on, unaware of the quiet shifts that had taken place that evening, those who had witnessed it would carry the lesson with them. True power is silent, true respect is earned. And as Michael Jai White had shown, real strength doesn't come from being the loudest or the most dominant. It comes from being the one who remains grounded, calm, and respectful, no matter the storm that rages around you. Respect isn't something you give only to those who can give you something in return. It's something you show to everyone, especially when you think no one is watching. In the end, Michael didn't need the spotlight. He didn't need the praise. The true victory was in knowing that, by simply being himself, he had changed the trajectory of not only that night, but the lives of those who had witnessed it. And that was the kind of power that could never be taken away.